Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to all of our podcast listeners around the world. My name is Martin, and I'm with the Argument Clinic podcast, joined by my lovely co-host Lawrence Zhao. Lawrence, how are you feeling this fine morning, evening, afternoon, or night?
It is indeed quite late at night, and I'm doing not terrible, which is about all I can say.
Not terrible? That's not all you can say. You can say, Lawrence, how do you feel about the Cheesecake Factory?
Very good cheesecake. Everything else is above average, overpriced.
I'll agree with overpriced. I don't like cheesecake. Everything I've had there has been mediocre, and I don't understand why people like it. I don't understand. It's so
I,
bad.
I think the reason people like it is one, the cheesecake. It actually is really good. And two
I'll
is
take your
because
word
it
for it.
is because the menu is so expansive that it doesn't matter who you take there. There's
It's
like
so
something for
expensive, and
everyone.
it doesn't matter what you order. It's gonna be bad.
I wouldn't say bad. I'd just say like slightly above average, but definitely not worth the
Slightly
price.
above average. Okay. Well, this is not food reviews
Or
podcast.
the mini debate yet.
No, many debate Cheesecake Factory good bad. That issue is not even close. But I seem to be on the opposite side of the entire rest of the world from that. Anyway, this is the Argument Clinic podcast. Whether you're a grizzled veteran of the tournament scene, someone who just likes to come and enjoy the sweet, sweet sound of Lawrence's voice, or appreciate my stellar jokes, this is the podcast for you. We are a debate podcast devoted to the fundamentals of debate. So, whether or not you think that you can get better at anything related to debate, this is the podcast for you. This podcast explores the core skills that you all get from debate. Although I will stress that this particular podcast episode is far more geared towards newer debaters, or at least debaters unfamiliar with the circuit style of debate, who should know most of what we're about to say already. But anyway, so where in the world have we been? So, since we've last recorded the podcast, I have been to the Harvard tournament. Yes. Have
Yes.
we? Yes, that one, which went fine. We got a debater in semis, lost two bid rounds, and had someone in triples, and then there was an insane fiasco that happened last weekend at CFL Quals, which I'm purposefully keeping Lawrence in the dark about, and that I will not certainly never say on the podcast. But so yeah, that was bananas. But so Lawrence, what have you been doing?
So I was on the opposite side of the country at the Berkeley tournament, which was fine, fun, good weather. I get back from the Berkeley tournament on Monday night at midnight because I have class on Tuesday morning. And I'm like, time to go to class. And I go to my 9 a.m. class, I go to my 10:30 a.m. class, and then noon rolls around, and this is when I get my break, and then I get a text which is like school is canceled because of inclement weather. And I'm like, oh, sweet, this is awesome. So I'm out of school for the rest of Tuesday. And then it keeps on raining and snowing and freezing. And so I end up out of school all of Wednesday and Thursday as well. And classes get back in on Friday, but I have scheduled my semester so that I don't have any classes on Friday. So I was out of school for the entire week, which is both awesome because I was like, oh, yes, no school, but also a little bit annoying because what if I just stayed in California for an extra week? That would have been awesome. Instead of being stuck in my apartment, being
That's a good
snowed
point.
in, with my car unable to start because of how cold it was. Why not just be out there? Because
Dude,
you know,
why didn't you tell me you had so many free times? I would have sent you so much quality TV watching
oh, I
like
mean that's like what I
opportunities.
was doing. So like,
Yeah, but like special, super high quality TV, like the television show I was telling you I was watching before. Okay, so Lawrence had a break. I didn't have a break. I've been preparing feverishly for the state championship that is this upcoming weekend. Okay, so Lawrence, would you like to inform the audience of our lovely sponsor, specifically what is their name and does it rhyme with uh Phalictory
that was so strange.
Leafs?
So thanks to Victory Briefs for sponsoring this podcast by providing the equipment and hosting support. Victory Briefs is a summer debate institute that is sure to improve your debate skills. Learn more about camp this summer and their brief products at vbidebate.com. Check out our LD and PF staff announcements on Facebook and stay tuned for more articles and announcements. I think Rafi just released an article about how to improve a debate just today. So that's good to watch out for.
That's exactly the point of our podcast. We are partnering with Victory Briefs because we have the same philosophy as Victory Briefs. We want you to get better, and by especially providing a large number of free resources for you all. We highly recommend that you patronize their camp. All right, so this episode, despite our banter, will be on the shorter side. We're going over a pretty basic concept, but a concept that I know personally a lot of people can sometimes struggle with, especially newer people. We want to break down this concept so that everyone understands it, everyone's on the same page. This concept, again, will seem trivial to a bunch of you, but to some other people, that will find out that they've been doing this wrong the whole time. So this is flowing. This is I believe it's called a choreography episode. Yes, this is a choreography episode. We will go over how in debate you should flow. What is flowing? What does it mean to flow? How do you practice flowing? What are the best methods to use? You may find that you've been using some of these methods all along, and you may find that some of these methods have escaped you. But if you have ever had difficulty following some of the stuff that your opponent have been saying in the debates, or just want to get better at it, this is the podcast episode for you. So instead of having our normal 3-segment thing, we're just going to have one pretty large segment with which we'll talk about it, and then we'll obviously get to our mini debate at the end. Lawrence, are you ready to go with the flow?
I am indeed. Right after this break.
Welcome to our one and only body segment of this podcast. We'll go over flowing in detail. We'll go over a couple things. First, we'll talk about what flowing is. We'll talk about why you should flow, what's the purpose of flowing. Then will be a pretty long segment on how flowing works, and then we'll have a segment about practicing flowing. Then we will have our outro and the only important segment of our podcast, the mini debate. Okay, so number one, we'll talk about what flowing is. Lawrence, what's flowing?
Flowing is
it a dance move that you do in the debate to throw off your opponents?
It is thankfully not. It is an organized way of taking notes in debate context. That's really it.
Debate note taking, right?
Yeah.
So why do they call it flowing? Is this an aquatic metaphor, Lawrence?
I actually am not sure as to why they call it flowing. I assume that it is sort of an aquatic metaphor because it is about following the flow of the debate, but it's just speculation on my part, and I actually have no idea where the term originated.
So what is the flow of the debate? Like abstracted from the like note-taking context. Like if you were saying like you were with the flow of the debate, like what would I take that to mean, you think?
To me, it'd be like you were following along with the arguments and the way that the arguments manifested and developed over the course of the speeches of the debate.
Yeah, because like kind of like an awareness of like the whole thing rather than like just the parts, but also like not leaving out the parts. By the way, when I was a novice, I went to like an incoming like a rising novice year debate camp, and someone made this point about so like someone made the like go with the flow joke, and I just actually thought it was hysterically funny. Because
I would like to say that I was a novice, but not at all.
I was a novice. I mean, to be fair, if you introduced that, like, but I like ironically like that joke now, but like back then I was like, wow, that's so clever. And everyone's like, no, what are you saying? Anyway, all right. So you want to keep track of the debate. Flowing just means the method that you use to do that. So note taking, as usual, can be done on paper or computers, but we recommend paper, of course. So what we're going to do over the course of this podcast, now that we know what flowing is, we're going to talk about why you should flow. What is the purpose of flowing? And then after that, we'll tell you how to flow. And when we get to that, we're going to divide that into 2 segments. The first segment, we're going to talk about some just very general things about how you would flow. And then we're going to talk about a specific method for flowing that we would highly recommend that you use, that we would insist that you use, that most debaters in the country nationally do this method, and we'll go into that in more detail. But some of the stuff that we're about to say in why you should flow, what is the purpose of flowing, is relevant to why that specific method that we'll mention to you later is a good thing. So pay attention when we talk about what the purpose of flowing is. So Lawrence, what is the purpose of flowing? So you mentioned something about how flowing, the goal of it's kind of like to keep track of the debate. Why would you want to do that? So you can do what?
Yeah, so if you're a judge and you're flowing a debate, if you're adjudicating it, well, the only point of flowing is really just to keep track of who made what argument, and so you can determine who won the debate at the end. But when you're debating, I think flowing has a more important component other than simply tracking what other people have said. It's more important because it allows you to know where to respond to and how to make good responses. And a lot of people don't flow when for the purpose of doing that. They only flow for the purpose of trying to get down what other people have said. But flowing is important because it enables you to debate, to make responses.
To make responses. So, Lawrence, in our previous episode, we talked about strategy.
We did.
With the lovely Zoe Ewing. So, in our strategy discussion, one thing that we mentioned was issue selection. That was one of the key concepts we discussed, which was basically selecting from multiple different things what you might want to talk about. And one thing that I think that we mentioned on that is the burden of rejoinder. Do you remember if we talked about that? I'm pretty sure we did, right?
Yeah, it was mentioned.
Yeah, so the idea is that an argument that is not responded to is considered true, and therefore if you can hone in on the arguments your opponent responded to inadequately or not at all, then that obviously gives you a huge chance. So Lawrence, do you think that flowing would be important in figuring out those things?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's hard to know, for example, if an argument was conceded if you weren't flowing. You could just guess as to if it was conceded or not, but there'd be no way of making sure.
So I think this is one of the key points about flowing. And here's the thing. So when I see what we're talking to you about here, what we're trying to sell you on is we're trying to sell you on an organized way of taking notes, specifically according to a couple of principles that we'll discuss later. We are trying to sell you on those principles. This is not contrasted with writing nothing, because we know that as debaters, you all will write something down when your opponent is speaking. To not do that is obviously ludicrous. I've seen very few, if any, debaters write literally nothing. Everyone's writing something. But it's important to realize why you're writing down things and to write down things in such a way that is optimal for you, and not just to be writing for the sake of writing. And flowing is an organized method of taking notes, that you follow the flow of the debate. One of the key concepts, and we'll talk about this later, but it's really important that you to understand this one from the outset. So it is pretty easy to remember the things that your opponent has talked about. And if you are taking notes at all, even if it's not in a super organized way, you should be able, even if you were writing paragraphs, to figure out what are the kinds of things that your opponent has said, and so that you may respond to those things. So that isn't the hard part. The reason that you flow is to keep track of what your opponent misses. Because one thing that I'm sure Lawrence will concur with me on. So Lawrence, you've judged, and I know that I have many debates that you would describe as legitimately tragic. Right, Lawrence? You've judged tragic debates.
Oh, yes, I have.
And, tragedy in the full sense of the word, what I mean by a tragic debate is a debate where one debater makes a mistake, and then instead of exploiting that mistake, a debater will then make mistakes in line with the original mistake, and the second debater might end up losing. So that debate is tragic because a set of consequences happened. There was a certain sense that you wanted things to go as a judge, but instead they went the wrong way. A debater made a mistake, it wasn't punished. There's a sense of injustice to that one. And so one of the main ways, in fact, the biggest way that I ever see of a tragic debate to happen is when one debater fails to respond to a large collection of their opponent's points. So if a debater, for example, does not respond at all to their opponent's value criterion, that's obviously a huge error. If someone talks about if their opponent then gets up and mentions their value criterion, all of a sudden they've nullified a good portion of their opponent's case. However, if you are just taking notes and you are only writing down the things that your opponent says so that you can respond to those things, you become completely unable to note what they have missed because you aren't writing down what they've missed. You're only writing down what they've said. So flowing is a way of organizing your notes in such a way that you will not only know what your opponent has said, but you will crucially know what they have not said at a glance. And that's the important thing about flowing, so that you know what they've said and what they've not said, so that you can fill in the gaps and so that you can exploit your opponent's weaknesses. So Lawrence, in the 20 years since I started my rant, how many Reddit threads have you investigated?
Actually, 0.
0? Did I enthrall you with my talking, or were you just looking at cute pictures of goats on Twitter?
I was on Imager.
Okay, well, that's definitely worse than just you investigating goat pictures. I'll send you a litany of goat pictures after the podcast ends. Okay, so now we're going to get into how you flow. And again, there are 2 segments to this. Number 1 is the things that you should all do regardless. And then the second thing is our specific method of flowing. So, Lawrence, let's talk about the first segment of this and the first subsegment of that, which is equipment. What equipment should people bring in order to flow and take notes?
So there's only 2 things you need. You need paper and you need a writing utensil, generally a pen. And that's it.
Okay, now, so writing utensil.
Yeah.
Which is a pen.
Yep.
And then you obviously should have a thing on which to write.
Yes.
After that.
Yeah. So the debate about equipment, though, is I think divided into each segment. So paper, a lot of people like to flow on legal pads, like the yellow paper with like the wide spaced lines that like you can flip over on themselves. And a lot of people also like to flow on print paper, like that has no lines on it. It's just plain white. And some people like to flow in like cardstock or whatnot, but those are bougie people and we'll leave them to the side.
Oh, look at me and my cardstock.
I used to debate with cardstock, but whoops. And so I think there's legitimate debate as to like which one is better. I'll just give like a few reasons for like why you might want a legal pad versus print paper, I guess. Legal pads are cheaper, easier to use to some degree. Like I guess the ability to like sort of flip pages is useful for some reason. And it has lines that some people like. I personally prefer print copy paper. I like the fact there are no lines, and the fact that you can that they're not sort of stuck in any particular order. You can just shuffle them around as needed. I mean, I think we'll talk more about that later. And I don't like lines on legal pads either. I find them to be like really restricting, and sometimes if I'm writing, it kind of like gets in the way because it's just like I'll have to like write on a line itself, and then I can't really read my handwriting. And I think it sort of arbitrarily confines how you write and like where you write and stuff like that. I like to just be able to sort of
be confined.
Yeah, I just like to free write. That's sort of
free.
I also write smaller than the average person, and so that's the paper stuff.
So one thing that I'll say about legal pads, so I, like Lawrence, use printer paper or just normal unlined blank white paper. However, here would be the reasons that you would want to use a legal pad. There really is one main one, which is that legal pads are kind of self-organized. If you have a legal pad, you don't need anything else. Because you don't need, like, for example, a folder to stash your excess pieces of paper. You don't need to shuffle around pieces of paper. It's just all there in one nice little bundle, that you can flip pages with as you must. It also becomes easier to check on the results of past rounds. If you want to look at flows from your past rounds, it's kind of easy to do that by flipping back through your pad. So the nice thing about pads is that it's a self-contained thing, but this is all personal preference. Okay, Lawrence, talk to me about pens. Number one thing is, or sorry, wait, did you want to talk about something else?
Oh yeah, one more thing is like letter versus legal size paper.
Okay,
I
talk about this in 10 seconds.
Yeah, I just personally prefer letter. I like legal is kind of like hard to carry around. But if you want like more vertical space to write, pick legal. That's up to you. Anyways, pens.
Yeah. So, okay, pens. I think Lawrence will talk with you in a little bit about like what are the kinds of pen brands that he likes if you choose to ever purchase pens with money. Which is, I guess, a thing that you could do that I did one time and regretted, or you can just like mooch off of other people. But the most important thing though with pens is that you want to have two different colors of pens.
At least.
Yes. Per individual debate, you will want two different colors of pens, and I'll talk in a second about why we want the different colors. But the first thing that I would recommend is it's important that your pen colors be dark, because it is easier to see from a distance. So have them be dark. The reason why you want different colors of pens is because you will want to flow yourself. You want to keep your arguments in one color and your opponents in another color. That makes it very easy to tell visually without even needing to process information or read who has responded to what when, so that you don't get confused about where you're writing stuff, and so that that's it. But just being able to easily differentiate between you and your opponent, really, if you aren't already doing this, it's actually it's way like more important than you would think to do this. It makes it a lot easier for you to just tell instantly when your opponent has not made an argument that they should have made, or etc. So two different colors. Now, Lawrence, talk about some of the pen varieties that you like for a short period of time.
Oh, I'm not even going to do that. I'm just going to give my personal recommendation, which are Pilot G2 pens in the .38 flavor. Those are the ones that I use. I have nothing more to say about that.
So is the .38 flavor, is .38 like a restaurant?
It is not. It is the thickness of ink.
It sounds like a restaurant that you would go to in LA, right? Welcome to the .38.
You're right.
We serve only steaks.
At $85. Yeah.
We serve only steaks and milkshakes. Artisan milkshakes that will cost, $48.82.
Yeah. Well, the only thing about .38s is that they're harder to find. I have to buy them from Amazon because all the rest of the pens are .05s.
When you say you have to buy them from Amazon,
I'm saying it's less than easy to acquire in a typical office supply store.
But you haven't, you meant you did, past tense.
Oh no, I still buy these pens. I use them for college.
Wow, this guy.
I told you, personal recommendation.
Well, he does have the personal experiences. G2 pens are nice. I also recommend those. But honestly, don't blow a bunch of money on pens. Just mooch them off of other people.
There are pens that are hundreds of dollars, and I'm like, I kind of want one just to be like, what could this possibly
honestly,
what could possibly justify the cost?
If you were like, this set of pens is $10, I would be like, that's equivalent to $100. That's a lot of money. I found all of my pens on the floor at my school that I use for debate. That's actually a true fact. Or I just mooch them off of people. Okay, so less about pens and paper. Have both different colors of pens, some paper, personal preferences, the rest of it. Okay, so in general, let's talk about flowings. So we have two sections here. We have one, how to listen when you are flowing, some tips about listening when you're flowing, and then two, what are things that you should put on the paper. So we have two things for how to listen and flowing. This first thing we have is finding key points. You wrote all this stuff down, Lawrence, so I'd like you to talk about it. So what are the two things for how to listen when you're flowing?
So when we're trying to listen for flowing, the first thing is sort of finding key points. Now, there are sort of the first way that a lot of people will like to flow is they just write down a lot, where they write tons and tons of stuff out. And I think this is sort of how a lot of people start off flowing, is they just write as much as they can, and every word or thing that their opponent says somehow makes it onto their flow in one way or another. This is generally for people who have like first learned what flowing is, kind of figured out what it is, and then are like sort of in there, like I'm just gonna write down as much as I can. I'm generally not a huge fan of this approach. And I'll explain why in a second, but I will say that there are some times where you probably want to write down more, because if, for example, you have no idea what your opponent is saying and they're just spouting some utter nonsense and you're really not sure what they're saying at all, then sure, write down some more, because it'll help you piece together what they've said and maybe you can figure it out later. But I think as a sort of general strategy, it doesn't make sense to write down tons of stuff. And so instead, I think we should focus on finding key points of what to flow and instead write smarter, not harder. So what do I mean by this? Well, I don't mean like don't flow at all. And I don't mean like flow the bare minimum amount possible. I think instead it's better to find the key things of what they've said and instead spend a lot more time trying to listen to what they're saying instead of just processing and just whatever they say makes it directly into your flow. Listen to what they're saying, and try to find those key points of what they're saying. Not everything they say is important. Like the random intro quote that they throw at the beginning isn't important, and not every single word in the contention is important either. So it's more important to find the key points of what to respond to.
Definitely agree. You were listening for those key points. I will say that, like, I certainly was in the camp of, well, I'm pretty not sure what my opponent is saying, so I am just going to write down as much as humanly possible in case I need a reference point, especially in cross-ex. If I don't understand it, then what I'll do is I'll look at my flow, pick out as many of the words that I could write down, and then I would ask them about those words. So in general, like it can't be that wrong to write down what your opponent is saying, especially if you don't get it. But you should be listening for what their argument actually is, not just random words that they're saying. And if processing that requires you to not do that, then that's what you should do. As Lawrence said, write smarter, not harder. So what's the next point?
Yeah, so this is part of writing smarter, not harder, and that is translating. So too many times I think people try to word for word copy what their opponent is saying, and then write that on their flow. I think this is a sort of problematic approach because one, you're probably not going to be able to fit it all in. Like you just don't write as fast as people talk. But number two is you're not really actively thinking when you do this. And the process of translating or taking what your opponent has said and making them into your own words and then writing those words on your flow is better for conciseness because you're more likely to make it easier to write. And B is it's good for active thinking, where it forces you to think about what they've said so you understand it a little bit better. So when you write it on your flow, it's not just some sort of mechanical translation like your computer translating what they've said into writing. It's you've thought about what they've said, and now you sort of understand their argument a little bit better. And so you're more prepared to answer or take on that argument when it's time for you to debate.
Okay, so 100% agree. What I'm going to do, Lawrence, is I'm going to present to you an argument on the universal basic income topic, and I want you to translate that as if what's the thing that you would actually write down. So here's my argument. A universal basic income narrows the gap between the very, very rich and the very, very poor. It does this by leveling the playing field, by taxing the rich and redistributing that money down to the poor, which ends negative the social impacts of a large gap between the rich and the poor.
Right.
So what would you write down for that?
Right. So without using abbreviations in shorthand, although I'm sure we'll talk about that here in a second, it just be something like UBI reduces income inequality / taxes the rich. And that's all I'd say.
Yep. Exactly right. So I did not use the words income inequality, and your opponents might not either. But you understand that point as the income inequality point. So exactly what Lawrence did. He translated the thing that I said into something else. And then he cut a bunch of the rhetoric. And then he just wrote down the reason. What was the actual reason? Well, it takes money from the rich and gives it to the poor. So Lawrence translated the concept into the appropriate one and wrote down the warrant exactly and nothing else. And that's exactly what you all should do. Good job, Lawrence. Good
Yay
job.
me. Woo.
You can float sometimes.
Maybe I'm qualified to actually talk about this subject. Who knows?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. Okay.
Same.
All right. So we've talked about how to listen when you're flowing. The next segment is what should you put down? So the number one thing that we have here is abbreviations and shorthand. And this is absolutely critical. And the reason for that is in debate, you will hear the same words and phrases either on a topic or throughout your Lincoln Douglas debate career an extremely large number of times. An extremely large number. And you do not have time to write down every single word that they say. You just don't. If you write down the word utilitarianism every single time someone says utilitarianism, then that's not going to go well for you. Writing down plea bargaining is hugely inefficient. You need to maximize the time writing the words that you do not expect to see. Therefore, the task of abbreviations basically is you creating a system for yourself of coding where you take some words and you vastly concatenate them, you vastly shorten them so that you can use just those symbols to express things to yourself. So, Lawrence, what are some common abbreviations you would recommend?
Yeah, so I'll just more or less say the most common ones, and then you, as the listener, can develop your own list, modify as needed, because, you know, flowing is still ultimately about you. But here are the ones that I think most people agree with. So, for example, justice is generally just a J, maybe with a circle around it, but just a J. Morality as a value is just M. Value is just a V. Criterion is just a C. Contention, I generally just give it a Roman numeral, depending on what contention it is. So if it's contention 1, it's just a Roman numeral 1. Turns are just the letter T with a dash next to it, maybe. An impact is an exclamation point. Increase is an up arrow. Decrease is a down arrow. The list goes on and on. But those are the ones that I think are some of the most common.
Subpoint A, I write SA.
Yeah, or I even just put A sometimes, so...
Yeah,
and there's no difference between them. It's just whatever works best for you individually.
Yep, cannot stress that enough. This is what works for you personally. This is not us legislating what random symbols you can or can't use. This is just things that come up a lot. Def for definitions is what I use.
Yep.
Util, obviously, for utilitarianism.
Yep.
Deont for deontology.
Yep.
OU for ought, because that word is in every single resolution.
That's true.
So I almost always write out OU. If you want to do value premise versus value criterion, VP or VC, there's got to be other ones that
there is, like, as a lab we compiled like a one whole page in like a Microsoft Word document just full of these terms, but I think it's better if people sort of just come up with them on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The ones that we've said that are especially important are obviously the content ones, but the ones like turn and impact, those ones are very important, and increase or decrease. The arrow signs save you so much time.
Oh yes. Ooh, so much.
And turn, very important as well. Whenever I write a straight up letter, I always circle it so that I can tell the structures of the arguments. This one's actually, well, we'll talk about that later, actually. Okay, so and then the other ones we mentioned are topic specific ones. This one is easy. If don't write down the words plea bargaining every time when someone says plea bargaining. Certainly do not write out universal basic income, right? Always abbreviate the subject of the resolution, UBI or something like that. UBI, plea bargaining, etc. Gun control, whatever the topic is. Okay, let's talk about the second thing. So
I'll add one more thing in there, is if it's a word that's not commonly used and it's not topic specific and you still need to make it shorter, I typically omit vowels from the word and just write down only the consonants. So it's easier to figure out. This isn't for everyone, but
so what I'll say about that is so this is truly the way that you will write down the most stuff. And I have trained myself to do it, as have Lawrence. This is a very, very easy way to get literally everything that your opponent is saying, is to omit easy vowels from the middle of words. So, for example, if I wanted to write down the word concentrate, instead of writing down CON, like CONCENTRATE, you'll notice that this has like a little more consonants than vowels, but has a lot of unnecessary vowels. So we can just do CNCRTE or something. So one thing that I'll mention is, so this is very helpful. However, it's very difficult,
It is.
which means you will this will take practice. This one in particular will take practice. There's no amount of us telling you that you can do it that will get you able to do it. However, if you manage to master this, you will actually not miss anything your opponent ever says. But so this is like the master, this is the thing that you would like go to the top of the mountain and like, train with like Master Zhao or whatever. Or Master Sigalo. If you were in like, I guess if you were in like some New York place, you could like train with me. Or Florida. You can come to the mountain of Florida, the tallest mountain in Florida, aka everywhere in Florida, because it's all the same height. But yeah, so that would be a thing that you would train yourself to do. However, it's very hard, but very useful. Okay, so we have what should you put down? We talked about abbreviations and shorthand. That one is so important. You all should really focus on doing that if you haven't already. And if you're already doing some of it, you should really master it. The second thing, though, is also extremely important, and these are symbols and other aids. So okay, we have purposes for symbols. So symbols are basically anything that's not a word that you write. So or that you draw, as a way of thinking about it. Some way that you will use your pen to indicate what is going on. Quick note about pens: you should use pens and not pencils, even mechanical ones, because it just flows easier. It's easier to write with. So okay, let's talk about the purposes of symbols. We have a couple things. So number one is card indicators. When your opponent reads a quote or a piece of evidence, you want to use some way of indicating to yourself that it is a card and therefore is an important thing that you will need to answer, or that's at least distinct from just your opponent's rambling. It's important that you know, because that distinction is important when you are in a debate round. So if someone has something that you've written down and it's a quote versus just their words, you would respond to it differently. Therefore, you should have some method of distinguishing that from other things. So number two is author names. You should always be sure to write down author names before those cards, and you can have a method of indicating to yourself the number of that thing. I also highly, highly recommend writing down lists of things in the way that they are presented to you. If someone has 3 arguments against your contention 1, you should write down a 1 and circle it, and then write down their argument. A 2, circle it, write down their argument. You don't have to circle it, but you can, do a little bracket or something like that. Whatever helps you, but indicate arguments in a list. Things in a series are important that you be able to distinguish them. If you just write a paragraph, the fact that your opponent has made multiple arguments may escape you. So it's important that you number those things. And then also, this one's very important, and it's a thing that you wrote, Lawrence. This is make note of key points. So how do symbols help you do that? And why would you want to do that?
So however you want to do it is up to the individual. I generally just like make circles on my flow or giant stars or something like that. And this is the reason why I said maybe at least 2 pens, because maybe you want to bring a 3rd pen and use that to circle it so it really stands out. Those are for the tryhard. So, if you want to do it, go for it. But it's definitely up to you however you make note of these key points. And the reason you want to do this is because not all arguments are created equal. I think, as we were talking about in our strategy episode, there are certain arguments that can win you a debate, and there are certain arguments that might cost you a debate, but that is not every argument. There are some arguments that are definitely more devastating, more important to answer than others, and these are things you have to respond to in the next speech. And so it's really important to star, flag, circle, however you want to do it, highlight these arguments, make note of them, so you know to respond or do something with them in the next speech.
Uh-huh. All right, so let's talk about the symbols that you would use to indicate all of these things. So, uh, let's talk about the very last thing that you said first. When there's a key argument, I know that I star it. Do you also recommend starring key arguments?
Yeah, I think I circle or but yeah, starring works too. I've done that as well.
Okay, yeah. So starring things, circling important things because they make it stand out on the page is also important. Drawing lines can be helpful to indicate cards or author names. And I also one thing that I did when I was a novice, and this thing was like pretty helpful, is I would like make a slight box and then I would write all my cards inside those boxes.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, that became less and less helpful when people started reading super long cards, and I ran out of box too frequently. But which is a funny and true fact about me. But like the box is, especially if your opponents like read, kind of shortish cards on average, is really helpful because then you stare at your flow, you know exactly how many pieces of evidence your opponent has, and you know exactly where they are. Do you have any other symbols that you would recommend?
No, I just say like make sure to use like symbols though. Like the reason for why it's kind of difficult to flow on computer and why I don't recommend it is because like drawing lines that like show which argument responds to where and like making sure that like these symbols stand out to you from just the rest of the floating text on the page. It's really important and it's really helpful in a lot of debate rounds.
Um, Yep, that's right. It really is important that it like stand out on the page. I mean, like if your flow was just like a bunch of random undifferentiated text, Lawrence, it'd be so much more difficult to get through, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, that sounds awful. Okay, so let's talk about our method of flowing. So, as we talked about earlier, the key reason that you all should think about using this method of flowing is, well, I mean, one of them is just like a credibility thing, which is that so many other people across the country do it, and it's all worked for them. It works for us. You should trust us. But the second reason is that thing that we were talking about at the beginning, which is it's important that you accurately be able to tell at a glance which arguments your opponent or you have not addressed, which means that you need to not just, have a note-taking system that writes down just the things that your opponent says, but visually you need to tell what arguments that they've answered or ones that they haven't. So, would you briefly outline this method of flowing, which we'll call the method?
Um, so we'll start by addressing, I think, one of the most common things that people don't do when they're younger is we should use a separate sheet of paper for every major argument or position that has been presented in this debate. And so for most debates, there's just going to be two. There's going to be the affirmative case and the negative case, and each one of these deserves its own sheet of paper. One will have 5 columns, obviously, and that will be the one that the affirmative cases flowed on because there are 5 speeches that relate to the AF case. So the 1AC, the 1NC, the 1AR, the 2NR, and the 2AR. The one piece of paper will have 4 columns, and that's where the negative case will be flowed because there's just the 1NC, 1AR, 2NR, and 2AR. There's not a 1AC in that speech, obviously. And so
Oh, okay. So this is just goes from my experience with like working with novices, and I understand that to many people, even though what we just said sounds like it's something that's easy, it confuses so many people. So the key thing that I want to emphasize about this method, and this really is the key difference, is that the piece of paper does not refer to the debater. It refers to the debate about their case. And you will write arguments from both debaters on each sheet of paper. Each sheet of paper will have arguments from both debaters. So each one sheet will have 5 columns, one for each speech. One sheet will have 4 columns, as you said. The 1AR column is on both of those sheets of paper, which means that it's not just, don't just write the entire 1AR straight down in one column. That will make it impossible for you to tell what arguments your opponents have not answered. If for example, in their 1AR, you just will not be able to tell. Each piece of paper represents somebody's case. Lawrence, should you use vertical or horizontal lines here?
Oh, vertical, absolutely.
Vertical lines, and why?
Well, for one thing is if you float horizontally, you'll probably just get laughed at. Number two is how do you hold horizontal like paper in debate rounds? It's like really weird because if you like to speak from like a folder or something like a presenting speaking folder, how do you do that? And most importantly, it's just because like there is a lot of stuff to say, and just like you would read a book, top down, because there's a lot of things to say in a given speech, it makes more sense to have narrowish columns where you can fit a lot more up and down as opposed to side to side. And because there's just more arguments that are going to be presented in upper level debates. I actually do want to like touch back on what you just said about like how it is important to distinguish it between its case and arguments. And I just want to be like, wow, it's really...
we're not done with that.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, because it's like really, really important, and people are really bad about thinking that it's about the debater and not the cases.
Yeah, very, very important. So flowing horizontally, not a thing because it prevents us from seeing who has responded to what. Even when you have the columns, though, the piece of paper should be vertical, and those columns should also be vertical for the last reason that Lawrence said, which is that Lincoln-Douglas debates, unlike things like public forum debates, are filled with long cases. The affirmative case is 6 whole minutes long. That is a huge length of time. And given another thing that we're going to tell you to do, which I guess we'll just say now, you should put space between arguments on any flow. So if you write an argument that on your opponent's case, you should leave some space before you start writing the next argument, such that when you start writing responses to it, you don't like bleed into the next argument if you make multiples of them. But so you'll notice that once you add that extra space, it really is very difficult if your paper was horizontal to fit everything. And of course, you can and should go onto the back, but even then, it's hard. So vertical columns, vertical paper. So let's go back to this like 5 columns, 4 columns thing. So the affirmative case goes on the affirmative case column. That one's easy. Now, Lawrence, for the 1N, assuming that the negative reads their case first, how would you flow that if you had the 2 pieces of paper?
Yes. So the negative will typically present a roadmap before this. They give the speech of the 1NC, and they will be like, I will first be presenting the negative case before moving on to respond to my opponent's case. Something like that. And so what they'll do is they'll start reading the negative case, and they'll be like, I negate the resolution, resolve, blah, blah, blah. And all of this should be flowed on the sheet of paper with 4 columns. And they're going to give their value, their criterion, and their contentions. And once they finish their last contention, they're going to be like, I will now move on to address or respond to the affirmative case. And at this point, you should move to the sheet of paper with 5 columns on it, and now begin lining up your responses that the negative is going to make next to the argument that the affirmative is presented that it is responding to. So yes, the negative will go off of my opponent's value of morality. And now we're going to have a morality versus justice debate. And so right next to that value of morality, you should put your pen and get ready to flow. And then the negative will say something like, my first response is that justice is a preferable value, and insert incoherent reason here. And then you will just write that argument down. And then they'll say like, now to my opponent's contention about utilitarianism, this is incoherent, 1, 2, 3, whatever you want. Something like that.
Exactly. Now, this is the whole advantage of everything that we've said up to this point. So you write the argument next to what it is answering. Do not just write someone straight down in a column. Do not just write down everything they say after they say it. That will make it impossible to know who has responded to which arguments, or rather, which arguments have not been responded to. But if you have the affirmative case and you have a big column, a big blank column next to everything in the affirmative case, that allows you to take your pen and easily skip to which argument your opponent is addressing. Let's say you're affirmative. If the negative says the negative might not start with the value. They might say, start with my opponent's contention 1 subpoint B. And it should be really easy to find. You look on your piece of paper, you look at your case, you find your subpoint B, you line your pen, you go next to it. There should be a blank column there, a bunch of space. Write down what your opponent says in that blank space. And then what? So let's say you do that. You record one response to your value, one response to your criterion, one response to your second contention, and one response to your third contention. Crucially, you'd be able to see that there's no response at all to your first contention. You have a nice, healthy bit of pregnant blank space right there that signifies to you that your opponent has made an error. That way, in the 1AR, you're like, aha, extend my first contention. My opponent did not respond to this at all. And
it's
then
devastating.
It's devastating. You don't have to claim that you've devastated your opponent, even if you have. But yeah, so that's what you should do. And I cannot stress to you how important this concept is. Write in columns, write with shorthand, write with symbols. When your opponent makes an argument, or when you make an argument, write it against the argument you are responding to. It also is helpful for you if you're in preparation time and you want to respond to the negative case. You don't want to just write out a random paragraph straight down, because then you won't know what you've responded to and what you haven't, or you won't have like a visual sense of it. But instead, you can just be like, all right, their criterion. You put your pen next to your criterion, you write a response. Then you skip down to one of their contentions, you write a response. You flip over to the affirmative piece of paper. You see that they've put an answer on your criterion. You're like, aha, I have to answer that. So then you put the 1. Then you scroll down. You see your opponent has made a turn. You're like, you aren't going to fool me. I'm going to respond to this turn so I don't lose immediately. So then you see their turn. You write the response next to it. You notice your opponent hasn't answered your second contention. You draw a line. I guess this is a thing that we didn't mention. Did we mention lines for extensions?
Not for extensions.
So one thing that you can do is, if there's a big blank space next to an argument your opponent hasn't responded to, you take your pen, go to your original column, draw a line straight through that blank space to your 1AR column, and you write extend. So that way you know to say, my opponent did not respond to this point. You can extend it. I have this point. It's crucial to the debate. Okay, so our job is to sell you on this point. You should have each piece of paper represent somebody's case. In each speech, aside from the AC, you will or should have to switch pieces of paper. It's important that you be vigilant about what your opponent is doing, whose case they're responding to, and what they aren't. Usually your opponent can and should tell you which ones they are. Sometimes they won't because they're silly gooses, and that's okay. Just try and follow along with what it is that they're saying. But if you execute this correctly, you'll know what arguments your opponents responded to, exactly with what points. You will also know what they haven't responded to, and you'll be able to argue in kind. Okay, so let's talk about some other things related to flowing. So one of these we already mentioned. You want to have a lot of space between things. So you want to have room for responses, room for overviews, etc. Lawrence, you've written something here which says post-it notes. What is that?
So this is an old technique, and it's still for some reason deployed in some rural parts of the country, like Oklahoma, where people will pre-write their responses onto sticky or post-it notes, and they will just post those responses on the flow wherever it belongs. And so that way they don't actually have to hand write all of their analytic responses anymore. They'll just put it right on the flow and just read off of a sticky note. They sometimes will do it for pre-flowing as well, which we'll talk about in a second, where they'll just write out their affirmative on sticky notes and just paste that in the column. So that way they don't have to like rewrite it every single time.
Huh. I've never heard about that other than with the thing about pre-flowing. That's like kind of neat, I guess.
Yeah, it's like too much effort in my opinion, but some people swear by it, so
That is wow. That's uh that's like secretly kind of like a decent idea. If you all like want to do that, that would be like pretty good. One thing though is you want to make sure you have some time to actually write out responses like during other things. Okay, so we have the last section which is using prep time. So there are two ways that you can use that can prep time can kind of relate to flowing. Number one is that it makes your prep time so much more productive. Now that you're writing in abbreviations, now that you're using the one, two, turn, and now that you're writing in shorthand, you can go up and down your flow super easily. I've seen people use prep time, write out some stuff in paragraph form, and come up with 3 total arguments. Like that is definitely very inefficient. What you want to do is you want to like look at your flow. You're like, okay, I want a response here. You shorthand a response to the criterion. You quickly move down, put a response to the contention, put a response to the next contention. Then you go back to defending your case, etc. It optimizes prep time. Flowing makes prep time so much more productive. And Lawrence, you also have something here about using prep time to clean up your flow. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, sometimes people will just like make mistakes while flowing, or they'll accidentally not leave enough room between arguments, or they'll just like can't read their handwriting or something like that. Utilizing prep time to make sure that your flow is legible for when you're about to actually debate is sometimes necessary, even though it'd just be better if, that didn't happen in the first place.
Yeah, true, true. Also, you may write out some responses in prep time that you didn't actually make. I mean, this happens.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
We all run out of time. Get too ambitious. So so make sure you like cross those off so you don't accidentally extend an argument in your 2AR that you you just didn't say it in the 1AR. That would be embarrassing. Um, okay, so the next thing that we want to talk about is pre-flowing. Lawrence, what is pre-flowing and how do you do it?
Pre-flowing is the practice of showing up to a debate round with all of whichever side you are, with all of your materials already written onto the flow before the speeches even start. So if you're affirmative going into a debate round, you will have already written on your flow all of the major key points of the affirmative case. So you know where to flow your opponent's responses when they're responding to your case. So you already have your value written down, all of the evidence that you've cited, your contentions, stuff like that. And when you're negative, the same exact thing. The reason you do this is because you have to write down what you say anyways, because otherwise, how do you know where to put your opponent's responses on the flow, and how do you know like what to extend, what has been dropped, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things that we talked about earlier. And the reason you don't want to do it during the round is because that's just an utter waste of time. You already know what you're going to say, hopefully, that you've done preparation before showing up to this tournament. I don't know. Some people show up without cases, I guess. But you should do this before the round because it saves time inside of round. And it's just good because it helps you memorize, what your cases are saying too as well.
Yeah, pre-flowing super essential, also super easy. You can also just like show up at the tournament and then pre-flow like in the morning or whatever. And like we're like between rounds, it's like super easy.
Or like literally 5 minutes before your round starts, as long as it's not during round.
I recommend not doing it straight up 5 minutes because so what you want to do is you want to write down your arguments and hopefully you should know your arguments in such detail that you won't need to write down much. However, when in doubt, always be as detailed as you possibly can for preflows. One cool thing that preflows let you do is it allows you to write down the one sentence summary of your argument so that you have access to that at all times, which means that if your opponent asks you a question in cross-ex about some detail, it's super easy to just look down at your preflow and you just have the one sentence answer already down there. So it's super easy. You can just kind of read it or recite it or whatever. So I recommend taking some time with your preflows. It shouldn't take you 2 hours to do a preflow. It shouldn't be, the next great work of American literature. It should, but it shouldn't, it doesn't need to just be like just a couple of words either. It shouldn't just be structured. There should be some content. Although if you know your case enough, just structure is fine. But like, don't give yourself just 5 minutes. Spend some time doing other stuff. All right. So the last thing that we have for you all in this segment is we're going to talking about practice flowing. Now, Lawrence, you've written down a lot of stuff here. Can you go through all of it?
I'll go through it pretty quickly because I think it's all relatively self-explanatory. So First thing is practice is key. This is not something that you're going to get good at by just listening to this podcast episode. For one thing, there's a pretty strong disconnect between hearing about it and like visualizing what a good flow looks like. So you definitely got to practice. The first thing is that legible handwriting is key. So I said earlier, like, yeah, the flow is for you. And I guess in the end, it really only matters if you can read your flow in the middle of the debate round when you're debating. Although some people can't even do that because their handwriting is terrible. So practice your handwriting. But I do think that there is some value in having a flow that is capable of being read by other people, and which means you need legible handwriting. And I think the reason for why you want it to be read by other people is that you might need to show your coach or other teammates or people that are willing to assist you what happened during the debate. And this flow is an easy way for other people to see what has happened and then guide you on how you might have done the debate differently and how you could have improved. And that's only possible if they can read what you've written. And it's also crucial for you because in a few days when the tournament's over and you might want to do some redos of those speeches that you gave, and you can't read your own handwriting, well, that's not going to be helpful for doing those redos. So practice handwriting, make sure you can write it and legibly. Number 2 is muscle memory. And flowing is just something you get naturally good at if you just do it for a while. And the more that you do it, it helps you not only write efficiently, but it also helps you when you're listening to debates discern what matters and what doesn't. So I said earlier, not everything is as important as everything else. There's some things that are of drastically greater importance, and you need to be able to practice flowing so you start picking up naturally what does and doesn't matter. Number 3 is you should just flow as much as you can, especially when you're a beginner or just like starting to transition into varsity debate. Flow everything: news, songs, class lectures, whatever you can get. The news is especially good to flow because it forces you to watch the news and become an informed citizen about the world, but also because it moves fast. I know it's unfortunate. I personally like recommending podcasts for news. So the New York Times and NPR both put out very short podcasts every morning. And so while you're on the way to school, you can listen to those podcasts and flow them, and you get the added benefit of, knowing something about the world. So
what's super hard to do?
What?
Is like songs.
Songs are difficult.
Some really fast songs. Like, sure, if you're flowing, Katy Perry's Firework, like that's like like medium. That's like medium level, right? By the way, Katy Perry is super good, but like the point is, like, it's not like super hard. But there are some songs that are, and the ones that are like really, really fast. I mean, like, so I'm trying to think of one. There was this one song. Oh, I remember what it is. So a lot of like the ultimate super hard one is like "Look at Me Now," but that one's like incredibly fast. And you don't need to flow incredibly fast. You mostly just need to flow incredibly accurately. So I do recommend the stuff that like Lawrence is using, like, which is like actual content. But like, if you want to just flow to just practice writing down things fast, then like "Look at Me Now" is super fast.
That is fair. There's also, I don't know what the song is called, but Emma Stone a few years back did a lip sync battle on Jimmy Fallon's show, and there's some song by the Blues Traveler on there, I think, that has like a really fast middle part of the song that if you can flow that'd be impressive. Anyways, also Emma Stone crushes Jimmy Fallon in this lip sync battle. Definitely the best. All right. Number 4 is watching debate rounds. Duh. I probably don't need to elaborate on this any further. Watching debate rounds, flowing debate rounds, that's good for everyone. Number 5 is, after you have a flow, is being able to explain everything from the flow. And this is good because it forms mental connections between like the symbols and the abbreviations and the things like that on the flow with actual words that you would say in a debate round. And the more that you do that, the more that the flow is going to be a useful tool during the middle of the round. And finally is integrating this with speaking drills. So a lot of people will have their class stand up and recite a tongue twister or something like that before class starts, or maybe at a debate tournament or something like that. instead of everyone just like sort of sitting around while some people are doing some speaking drills, use this as an opportunity to flow those speaking drills and see how much of the speaking drills you can catch. I think that's everything, right?
All right. Okay, good stuff. When we return, we'll discuss very little and then have a mini debate. Thanks for everyone staying with us. Check out our sponsor, Victory Briefs. We use the Victory Briefs for this resolution to craft a lot of the responses that we had on the March and April topic. It's truly tremendous. I cannot recommend it enough. Victory Briefs also an excellent debate camp and purveyor of debate news and bid lists. And whatever. Please check out our SoundCloud page for all of our old episodes. This is one of the ones that we've geared more towards new people. We have a lot of other episodes, including a novice primer on Lincoln Douglas debate, tons of really great basic concepts, as well as some advanced stuff. If for some reason you're still listening and you do the advanced things. Okay, so now to the only important segment of our podcast, the mini debate. I don't know if we've already done this topic, but I don't think we have. I want to talk about what is the best Marvel movie?
Oh, interesting.
So this topic is good because there are a lot of legitimate answers, right? There are a ton of answers that I think are defensible and like acceptable that like you can do. There are some ones that are like obviously wrong. In particular, there's one that's like incredibly wrong. And then there are like a bunch that are like definitely like not first, but like also like not last. And then there are like a couple that you could say are like in the running for first. So for now, I'm gonna ban Black Panther because I haven't seen it and therefore would not be able to debate you on it. It's also like very like flavor of the month. I don't know if you've actually seen it. But okay. So Lawrence, hit me with your argument. I also could consider if your argument is good enough, just like agreeing with you and conceding. But all right, so best Marvel movie. Well, you know what? Let's say Marvel superhero movie, because my actual Marvel favorite movie is not a superhero movie, unless you want to have that debate.
Okay, so thanks for banning Black Panther. I actually have not seen it yet, despite the fact that I really want to. But I think by all accounts, I think the reviews make that number one. After that, I think my favorite Marvel movie would have to be the first Iron Man movie.
Good choice.
First of all, in terms of just pure ratings, I think it's up there. I don't know if it's number 1, 2, or 3, but it's definitely up there. Number 2 is it was the first movie that really spawned the whole generation of Marvel movies that allowed Marvel to like create phases and like plan out the new Marvel universe. Number 3 is like it's just like a good story. It's like fresh. It was original. It was like fun to watch. It had good CGI. It had good characters. There's very little to dislike about the first Iron Man movie, and it's like it even has like a good like storyline of sort of like Tony trying to like find himself and like figure out what's going on. I really don't see any complaints about the movie. I think it's better than, for example, the Avengers because it really focuses in on one character and you have to like care about what that character does. And I think it's pretty fresh and original, even though I really like the Avengers movie as well.
Mm-hmm. So I definitely am not going to select Avengers. I'm going to argue against your first 2 points, but not your third one. So I don't think that I don't think we should base our opinion just based on reviews, and I also don't think that we should use like influenced other movies as an argument. I kind of just want to look at them as standalone items because it's so hard. It's like how many bonus points do you give something for spawning this other thing? It's like that just kind of like leads to madness. Down that road lies madness. But you're right that the movie was a very good origin story. It was certainly very, very compelling, and I definitely think that it's better than the Avengers. So I have a couple that I could choose from here, but I'm gonna go with Spider-Man 2. Not like Amazing Spider-Man 2 or whatever, which I obviously haven't seen because who has? But so Spider-Man 2 with Tobey Maguire, I think his name is. And so that movie was incredibly good. It had an incredibly compelling villain. It had an incredibly compelling story that doesn't often get told in superhero movies of like the superhero thing is like getting too hard and he kind of like loses his mojo, decides not to become a superhero. And then of course, gradually sort of earns it back and rediscovers what it means to be a superhero. The story is incredibly good, the action is incredibly good, the villain's incredibly good, and I think it is pretty much like consensus like one of the best. And the movies are like so different. It's like so hard to compare them because like Spider-Man 2 isn't an origin story, whereas like Iron Man 1 is a very, very good origin story. But like and Spider-Man 2 is not one of those, but like tells very like complex adult things as well as Iron Man 1. Wasn't as flashy. I do think that the villain in Spider-Man 2 is probably better, although the villain in Iron Man 1 is definitely cool as well. Just like Dr. Octopus, dude. Like, you know, the scientist that's like obsessed, but like sort of slightly possessed by his claws and materials, trying to do this thing to become a super weapon, but he like turns good kind of like at the end when he kind of like snaps out of it. I don't feel bad about spoiling the plot of Spider-Man 2 from like 2004, but like if you haven't seen it, you like really should watch it. It's like super good. Lawrence, do you have any thoughts on Spider-Man 2?
I actually have not seen it. It is in my watch list.
It's actually so good. Have you seen the like original Spider-Man 1 with Tobey Maguire?
No, and so that's again part of my watch list.
That one is also very good. It's definitely not as good as 2, but like it's definitely like very solid. That one's an origin story. I will say that like Iron Man 1 is better than Spider-Man 1, but like I think Spider-Man 2 is up there. But I'll just declare myself the winner because Lawrence hasn't seen Spider-Man 2.
Well, in fairness, it's functionally concession, and if you'd flowed, you would be able to catch that.
Probably not. Okay, well, thanks to everyone for listening to an inspiring episode of the podcast. I hope that I inspired you to like flow and whatever. Okay, everyone, I'll see you again in another 2 weeks next Wednesday, so stay frosty.
This isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.